So I'm with my colleague DJ Williams here at Idaho State. So he is a professor of sociology, social work, and criminology. He got his master's degree in social work at the University of Utah, so not too far away from here, and his Ph.D. at the University of Alberta. He's also the co-founding editor for the Journal of Positive Sexuality. And one thing I appreciate about you, DJ, is every time we chat, I come away and I learn something new.
Thanks.
And you're always doing something. Like you always have a new article, a new journal, new activity. So I'm excited to learn more from you today.
And back at you.
Yeah. Well, thank you. So I'd love to start by, you've done so much with setting up the Journal of Positive Sexuality, and you research in so many areas, and one of those is kind of leisure science and pornography. Why don't you just tell us a bit more about how you got into this? Sure. Why set up the journal? Why study pornography?
Sure. Where to begin?
Retrace the roots.
There's a long journey with all of this sort of thing, but with the Journal of Positive Sexuality specifically, in my research, as I became more fluent with the field of sexuality and again looking at sexuality from some different disciplines, including leisure science, which is a pretty new connection, and gives us new insights on how to think about sexuality and different sexual topics. We realized, Emily Pryor and I realized that there's so many myths about sex and sexual behavior. And these myths are inherent in contemporary sex education. These myths are prevalent in the general public. They're prevalent with professionals. I have a background working with sex offenders. And when I look at our policy with sexual violence and sex offending, but then I look at the research, it's like policies going 180 degrees the other direction.
They don't match up.
They don't match up at all. In fact, one of our recent studies, we found that our policy probably increases recidivism risk as opposed to decreasing it, which is terrible, of course.
That haunts me. When I learned that from you, I'm like, we've got to change this. Like,
we need
what
to
we're
change
doing
it.
is making the problem worse.
So kind of looking at all of these different myths and problems and all this misinformation about sexuality, Emily and I decided that we needed to do something to try and address this on a global scale as best that we could. And so we thought about creating a journal that was open access, where clinicians can access it, students can access it, educators can access it, the general public can access it, and so we can share current research on a number of these different topics, counter some of the myths. We wanted the journal to be peer-reviewed, high academic quality, but we also wanted to have kind of shorter articles. So we looked at a series of journals at Harvard. I'm not sure if you're familiar with these, but the Brief Addiction Science information source journals. So several years ago, Harvard published this series of journals, and they're fully peer-reviewed. They're good, rigorous research, but they're short.
So people can actually
5 or
read
6
them,
pages,
understand
exactly.
them.
So people can read them. How many people have time to read a 30-page paper that's really technical?
Yeah.
So we thought about that. Again, we wanted to speak to a broad audience. So we wanted user-friendly terminology as best we could. And we looked at a journal in sociology called Context, and it's purposely geared to be user-friendly, to speak to a wide range of people. And then we looked at, there's a journal in gambling studies, which I have a bit of a background in as well. And the Journal of Gambling Studies has been fully online, peer-reviewed, rigorous for years and years and years. So we kind of took these different formats and combined them to meet our needs. How do we reach a big audience? How do we speak and disseminate good information to just people who are interested, and they can read these short articles and understand them? And clinicians, most clinicians lack training in sexuality. So how do we reach as many people as possible but still have good quality peer-reviewed stuff. So, hence the Journal of Positive Sexuality.
Because there's so much good research out there, it's just not
There
that
is.
accessible for the average person.
Absolutely.
Even the clinician that's doing the work,
Right.
they don't read the articles.
Absolutely. And so anybody can type on. If you Google the Journal of Positive Sexuality, you'll see the website. It's multidisciplinary. Articles tend to be short.
Yeah,
On all kinds of topics.
that's wonderful.
And, we have readers from all across the world.
Oh, that's exciting.
Which is pretty
Let's take it
exciting.
up.
Yeah.
So I hope people take that opportunity to check out the
Absolutely.
Journal of Positive Sexuality.
And with our version of sexuality, like everything is open to scholarly inquiry.
Mm-hmm.
We can study pornography. We need to know the science behind it. We need to know the research. Any kind of sexual behavior is open for scholarly assessment.
But not like stuff like kink or BDSM. You
That's-
shouldn't research that though, right? DJ?
Oh, never. Yeah, that actually was part of the thing that got me into sexuality studies too, because I grew up with the same myths.
Yeah,
Especially researching sex offenders.
yeah.
Some of these deviant sexual interests, well, they are risk factors for sexual crime. And when I looked into the literature, I found that was completely not true.
Wow.
People who regularly engage in kink and fetish and these kinds of things actually are at least as psychologically healthy as controls, if not more so, studies find.
And I read that consistently where it's
Yes.
like, yeah, maybe they're a little more adjusted or a
Right,
little more open or maybe some safer relationships.
right. And even have fewer myths about things like sexual violence and rape. There's studies now on
Wow.
that, which is pretty
Wow.
cool.
And it's so backwards from kind of the common belief or what we
Right.
would assume.
Right. So a lot of those assumptions tend to not be true when
Yeah.
we start doing the research.
So when you've done like research on pornography, what are some of the common myths that you've
Sure.
heard that you've like, wow, that's so different from what we're finding in research?
Absolutely. So some of the common myths that we find are that, if a person looks at pornography, it's going to escalate into more serious behaviors and criminal behaviors. And we find that's not true. And some of that information comes from simple correlations. So Ted Bundy, for example, on death row, blamed pornography for him going out and murdering all these people.
Yeah, he's famous for that quote.
He's famous for
Yeah.
that quote, and so many people buy into that.
Yep.
Well, let's think about Ted Bundy. Do you think he would want an out to not take responsibility?
Yep, point to anything.
Right.
Yep.
And that was an easy target, and a lot of people believe that.
Yeah.
I've heard attorneys talk about how the sex offenders that they have defended or whatever consistently look at pornography. They consistently eat breakfast too. And many of them have ridden a bicycle.
Oh no.
So
we're
we
all
probably,
in danger then.
Right. We shouldn't ride a bicycle. We shouldn't eat breakfast because that correlates with offending.
Yeah.
So it's a lot more complex than that. Recent research on pornography shows that people who look at pornography actually don't hold any more, in fact less, anti-feminist attitudes and beliefs.
Really?
Again, it's almost the opposite of what you would expect.
How does that work? Because a lot of people view pornography as objectifying towards women.
Sure.
How would that somehow cultivate the inverse of that?
I think the big issue, and I think this is really what we should be talking about, has to do with porn literacy. So sure, people who don't have good sex education, people who believe some of the myths and that sort of thing, sometimes that fuels fantasy
Yeah.
about aggression, but that doesn't always translate into behavior. So people have all kinds of different sexual fantasies. In fact, one study found that the diversity of fantasy in the normal population is just immense.
Yeah, unlimited. Yeah.
But fantasy and reality are two different things. So a big part of that issue, I think, has to do with recognizing that fantasy and behavior are not the same.
Yeah.
And that doesn't translate straight across.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think too with pornography, you have to realize what you're looking at. So if you go to an action movie, Hollywood produced, rated PG, and you see all this action and people speeding down the freeway and cars and doing all this stuff, we understand that's not real.
Yeah.
And we have to think about pornography the same way. This isn't real. This is like an action movie
Yeah, this is
of a different
media.
variety.
This is entertainment.
It's entertainment, but it's not sex education.
No.
And so I think, again, a big part of this is porn illiteracy, or that lack of education about sexuality,
Yeah.
which again comes from more myths. Sex education in this country is really horrible.
Yeah, so I think, how would you describe it? Absent to horrible? Yeah.
Absent, horrible, any of those descriptors
Yeah.
fit, I think. I was flying from a conference a few years ago, and I was sitting next to a graduate student from Finland. And we were talking about our research and some different things, and we were talking a little bit about sexuality. And she says, you know, Dr. Williams, before I came to the United States, I didn't even know there was such a thing as teen pregnancy.
Really?
The Nordic countries, who are much more open about sexuality, have far better sex education programs. We see fewer rates of STIs, we see fewer rates of sexual violence, teen pregnancy, all those kinds of sexual problems. So really good, open discussions about sexuality actually help,
Yeah.
rather than increase risk.
That's the answer.
Right.
And the fear is, if I talk to my kids about sex, they're going to have sex. And
Right.
But it's not
It's
the
not
case.
true.
It just doesn't pan
Right.
out that way. We
Right.
see it in countries that have better sex education. The data's there.
Absolutely. And with sex education, no matter what goals we have, and in the United States, a lot of our goals aren't really specified. So what are we trying to do? Are we trying to reduce STIs? Are we trying to reduce teen pregnancy? Are we trying to delay onset of sexual experience? Comprehensive sex education does better than otherwise at each of those.
Yep.
So, again, more myths.
Yeah. And I think it's a struggle, because a lot of it, I mean, thinking about my own background growing up in a religious home,
Sure.
sex was a moral issue. So it was
Right.
like, sex is something you don't do, or we
Right.
don't talk about it.
Right.
And so a lot of people that grow up in those contexts are curious about bodies and
Sure.
sex. And so when there's not education, they often turn to pornography to learn.
Absolutely.
Which isn't my favorite source for people to learn about human
Sure.
sexuality.
Right. Again, it's like learning to drive a car from watching an action movie where
Yeah,
they're speeding down
Fast
the
and the
freeway.
Furious. It's like,
Right?
that's not how you
This
drive.
is not what we want to do.
This is not realistic. It's not how it works.
Right.
Yeah.
Same kind of issue.
So what other myths have you heard about pornography? You mentioned it doesn't lead to violent or
Doesn't lead to
aggressive behavior.
violence, anti-feminist attitudes. Again, the literacy is a big issue with that, but that pornography is addictive also does not have science behind it. So
That's how people talk about it, though. It's an addiction.
It is.
And you're saying there's not a lot of science.
There is not science behind that.
You're saying not zero.
Very, very little.
Yeah.
The science is extremely weak, and the science that counters that is actually pretty strong. So there are a number of neurobiological studies, you've been a part of some of those,
Yeah.
that show that brain patterns are inconsistent with other known addictions.
Yep.
So there's evidence on this issue from some different disciplines and sources, which I think is really important to note. It's not like one body of knowledge has this critique, but we're finding there are multiple bodies of knowledge that have a critique against the addiction model for pornography viewing. And one of those that we're looking at now is leisure science. So if we look at what people assume in terms of pornography being addictive, you tend to hear that 11 to 12 hours of viewing a week signals an addiction. Well, most people watch television more than that.
Addicted to TV, then.
Addicted to TV, right. Do they need treatment? Well, probably not, right? Or their phones, or Netflix,
Oh,
or
man.
their computers.
Social media time's probably got to be up there now, too.
Absolutely, absolutely. And interestingly, from a leisure perspective, if something is leisure, there are two essential criteria. The activity is relatively freely chosen, and it's intrinsically motivated. So people do it for its own sake. So skiing is a leisure activity. Going to museums is a leisure activity. Going for a walk out in the woods is a leisure activity. There's innumerable different activities.
Yeah.
As long as they're intrinsically motivated and freely chosen. So how about sexuality? How about looking at pornography? That can be leisure. That fits those criteria.
But that makes me uncomfortable, DJ, to call that leisure, because sex is something that we don't think about that could be playful or okay.
Right.
It feels scary or taboo.
Sure, but that's driven by those narrow sort of discourses about sexuality. That sex is this. It's for
It's
reproduction.
different
Right.
than watching sports.
Right. But not necessarily. It meets the same criteria, and people get different things out of sexuality. So, from a positive sexuality perspective, it's important to look at risks of sexual behavior and problems, but also to look at benefits and potential fun and the different meanings that it has for people. And those are broad.
Yeah.
So people may engage in playful sexuality, and it's the playfulness that they really enjoy as well as the sexual stimulation itself.
Yeah.
It may be the closeness or trust with a partner. There's all kinds of other benefits that can happen, which are consistent with leisure,
Yeah.
which is kind of cool.
That's neat.
But we haven't looked at this from a leisure lens.
No. Yeah, the first time I heard of that was from you, and I thought, I've never thought about that, but when you bring it up, it's like, that fits.
Sure.
It's just a helpful way to talk about it without
Sure.
pathologizing it or making it scary or dangerous.
Right. So if we compare leisure activities, of which there's a whole literature, a whole science about this, people who like skiing, people who like the outdoors, going to museums again, or going to baseball games, there's a whole science and literature about this. So if we take that and move it into looking at pornography viewing or sexual behavior, we see the very same things line up in terms of potential benefits, in terms of the cost that people spend, to do these different behaviors. Leisure is very individualized. Sexuality is very individualized,
it
right?
does.
So it really fits. A lot of people spend well over 10 hours a week, 12 hours a week at their leisure,
Yeah.
and we assume it to be healthy.
Yeah.
People use leisure to cope. And when we look at pornography viewing, the addiction people say, well, coping is a sign that it's an addiction. Well, it might be a sign it's leisure, right?
Right.
It's the same issue.
Right.
The addiction people say, well, there are costs and consequences, which show that it's an addiction. Well, there are costs and consequences to skiing.
True for leisure.
Right.
Yeah.
People spend money to go to the baseball game.
Yep.
Time away from family or time,
Yep.
So when we look at these criteria, we see these same criteria with leisure, and yet leisure is positive and healthy.
Yeah.
Whereas the very same criteria with pornography viewing is too often assumed to be negative.
Yeah.
So we have to be able to differentiate that somehow. And I think that the important thing is more of the moral piece with that. If someone's leisure doesn't really fit their moral code and beliefs, then they probably need to change their leisure or adapt it.
Yeah.
If they look at pornography and they want to stop, and for moral reasons, that's a good, valid reason.
Yeah.
And they may want to try and change that.
Yep.
But somebody else may interpret this very, very differently, and it may work very differently for them.
Yeah.
And when we look at it this way, that's what lines up with the body of research
Yeah.
from these different areas.
And I like that, because viewing it as leisure, it almost like opens up the arena where we can just understand and explore it
Sure.
without getting stuck where,
Sure.
well, this is bad, I can't think about it, talk about it, reflect
Right.
on it. It's like, no, let's understand the benefits,
Right.
what you get out of it, what are the drawbacks.
Right. And interestingly, even though leisure has not been looked at and examined with sexuality until now,
Are you one of the first?
Mm-hmm.
Are you the first?
I'm one of the first.
One of the first, yeah.
There are a couple of leisure scientists who talked about it about 2007, 2009. I got in around that time. There's a special issue of the scientific journal, Leisure Sciences. The whole issue is devoted to sex and leisure. We have a couple of papers in that. There's a new book coming out, an anthology by the world's top scholars, kind
Wow.
of starting to dig into this. We have a chapter in that.
Wow.
So I think this is really going to take off,
That's exciting.
which is exciting.
I hope that'll go a long ways in changing the narrative around pornography.
I hope so too. And again, because it fits.
Yeah.
People have different moral views with different leisure activities.
Yep.
There
I think
are
about
moral
that
issues.
for myself. Like, I love sports, love basketball.
Mhm.
I mean, the NBA playoffs, I'm locked in.
Right.
But my challenge was, like, I have small children.
Sure.
And I'm like, the time I'm spending watching basketball is inconsistent with my values. I want
Right.
to spend time with my kids. And
Right.
I wouldn't say I was addicted to basketball. I really love it.
Right.
And I stopped viewing. I stopped my TV subscription.
Right.
I still love the sport, still check scores, but
Sure.
I wanted to shift my focus to something else.
Absolutely. Another nice thing, thinking of it from a leisure perspective again, which it fits, and the scientific literature kind of lines up this way, but it's not an all or nothing option. So you don't have to completely give up basketball
Oh,
necessarily.
thank you. I was at the game last night. I loved it.
Sure, that was an exciting game.
It was a great game.
Right. But people can modify that
Yeah.
based on their needs and beliefs. And those
Brought my
kinds of
kids
things.
with me, so that was okay.
Good solution.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Still a good dad at the game.
Don't look at porn with your kids. I
Probably
wouldn't
not the
recommend that.
best.
Yeah. But yeah, so it's exciting, I think, in
That's
terms
awesome.
of the science behind this.
Well, thanks for being a pioneer with that.
Sure, thanks.
Because you're like pushing the boulder up the hill, and I just get
Sure.
to like, oh, thanks for the path.
Yeah, we get a lot of flack. You know, there are a lot of people who don't want to hear this and don't want to
Yeah.
look at the science.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of clinicians, unfortunately, who have jumped on the addiction narrative.
Yeah.
And a lot of clinicians have very, I want to say, monolithic views of addressing this, which again doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah.
If sexuality and sexual behavior and leisure behavior for that matter is really complex and individualized, then how to change that and modify that is going to be complex and needs to be nuanced as well. And I
Absolutely.
don't think we're there yet.
Nope. So what do you think the appeal is of just calling porn an addiction and kind of stepping away? Like, why do you think that label has been around for so long and so prevalent?
That is a good question, and there's some different, if we look historically at that, there's some different factors that come together. So the sex addiction, pornography addiction narrative kind of really took off in the early 80s.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a time when there was more sort of awareness of sexual victimization and sexual assault in some ways. And so I think that narrative kind of grew together with some of that early awareness or more focused awareness. So I think that was part of it. And then right around that time, a little bit later, we start to see celebrities who get caught cheating.
Tiger Woods scandal.
The Tiger Woods scandal, some of those kinds of things. And those stories get lots of media attention.
Yeah.
And so once you attach a label, addiction, then it really takes off because of the media.
Yeah.
And so I think that's
a big part of it.
a big part of it. And the roots of using this concept go back to that time. And I think at the time people really thought it may be an addiction.
Yeah. It's a reasonable, like, hey,
It's a reasonable
this might cross
interpretation.
over from substance use. Let's check it out.
Absolutely. But we didn't have any science then.
Right.
You know, and so when the science started to catch up, then it's like, wait a minute, you know, this may be problematic, and often it is, but something being a problem in different ways is not nearly the same thing as an actual addiction.
They're different, yeah.
They're different.
That
So-
speaks to me, because I think
Yeah.
some of the research we published, I mean, the media took it and said, oh, you just disprove sex addiction. It's like, no, that's not how science works. That's
Right.
not what I was studying. We're just looking at better ways to conceptualize it.
Right.
But media takes that and runs.
They do.
And then I think from those headlines, we would get backlash from people that really believe in addiction.
Sure.
And it is just a strongly held view that
Sure.
when it's so strongly held, it's hard to entertain
Right.
other science or data that
Right.
talks about it a little bit differently.
And I think too, you know, around that time when the concept was sort of taking off, I think there were very well-intentioned clinicians
It's my view too.
who wanted to change things, right? But going back to the myths, you know, we don't receive training in human sexuality
No.
in the clinical disciplines, unfortunately, very little. And so when you have people who are well-intentioned and who are kind of reproducing this term of addiction, who aren't really that well trained,
Yeah.
then we have this whole thing take off.
Yep. That's my experience too. I've met so many good clinicians and researchers that their intention is to help somebody with a
Right.
behavior.
Right.
So if all you know is addiction, you're going to use addiction.
Absolutely.
And I understand that and
Right.
get that. And for me, when I embarked on my research, I went into it thinking that I'm going to prove sex addiction. Like,
Sure.
it didn't even cross my mind that actually that model might not work because it was
Right.
the only one I'd heard of.
Right. And it makes sense at face value.
It does.
And people can relate to it and understand it.
Yeah.
The other thing kind of in that mix, too, is that even sexual scientists were not as aware of our cultural biases in studying sexuality. So that was an issue in this whole thing, too. It's only been relatively recently that we've started to pay more attention to cultural bias.
In research.
In research,
Yeah.
from a scientific perspective,
Yeah.
right? So, for example, I tell my students this all the time, if you were born in ancient Egypt, thousands of years ago,
Yeah.
your sexual norms would be really different
Yep.
than they are now. And so some of the things that we think are much more objective and scientific, they're still in a culture.
Yep.
And
Still
that
embedded.
culture has been sex negative based on myth.
Yep.
So we even have to back up further and look at those assumptions.
Yep. It's hard to pan out far enough to see that, though.
It is.
How sex negative our culture is.
Absolutely. It's difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's fun. It's
It
fun
is.
to figure this
Oh,
stuff
you
out.
do great
Play
work.
with it. Thanks.
Another myth I hear a lot is, and it's a big fear, of that pornography is more addicting than drugs. And I've
Sure.
worked with people, using meth or chronic alcohol use.
Right.
I mean, you've worked in the prison system.
Absolutely.
How can you speak to maybe similarities or differences between pretty severe substance use and
Sure.
someone viewing sexual images?
I think they're completely different. I think they're completely different from a scientific perspective with what we know now from research, but my clinical experience is also that they're really different. Somebody who's addicted to cocaine or methamphetamine, that runs the show.
Yeah.
No question about it.
Yep. Your life is hijacked.
It's hijacked, right. Biologically, that's true. In terms of their social and occupational functioning, that's true. Whereas when we look at pornography viewing, even if it's quite frequent, we do not see the same implications. We just don't. A vast majority of people have looked at pornography in their lives. A lot of people still look at pornography, and yet they navigate relationships and
hold down jobs
and they manage it, and fair enough. So I think they're completely different. Yeah.
That's my experience too, just clinically working with people. It's night and day the level of impairment I see with extensive
Sure.
meth use
Right.
versus I occasionally look at sexual images. It's
Right.
extremely different.
And that's the interesting thing, again, bringing a leisure perspective into the mix. Because when we do that, we can see differences where people using meth and cocaine, it may be recreational leisure at first.
At first, yeah.
But when they get addicted, it's not leisure anymore.
Not anymore. It's not that
Not-
freely chosen
Right.
element.
But when we look at frequent pornography viewing, it still comes out as leisure,
Yeah.
right?
It's different.
So there's a real difference in terms of intensity.
Yeah. Have you heard folks talk about, like, if you view pornography a lot, you'll experience erectile dysfunction? Have you come across that?
I've come across that.
What's your take on that?
My take on that is that I think there was an early study or two that was pretty much simply correlational,
Yeah.
and there are some issues in terms of the sampling, but there have been a number of studies since then that have refuted that.
Yeah.
The other interesting thing with that is people will say, well, if someone looks at pornography in a related way, they're not interested in actual sex. They don't have a desire for their partner. That's not true either.
Yeah, that seems odd
Looking
to
at
me,
porn and having sex are different.
Right.
Right? And so I think people say that perhaps because maybe their sexual experiences aren't as satisfying as they want.
Yeah.
And so oftentimes people look at pornography because they're curious about things. Right? Again, our lack of sex ed.
Curiosity.
But they feel like they can't have open, honest communication with their partner.
Yep.
So they don't talk about their
Yep.
sexual interests and desires, so then they look at porn.
Yep.
And here we go. When the real issue is that lack of communication and openness.
Just comfort about talking about your
Right.
body and sex.
Absolutely. And sometimes people are mismatched in their libidos. One person has a much higher sex drive than another person.
It's going to be pretty common.
And it is relatively
Yeah.
common. And again, the solution, I think, is more conversation and discussion
Yeah.
as opposed to hiding.
But conversation discussion would take effort. That's
Sure.
uncomfortable. It makes us vulnerable. Isn't it easier just to say I'm an addict and I'm not responsible for
It is easier.
actually talking with another human?
It is easier, but it's not going to work.
It just doesn't work.
It's not going to work. People are going to be unhappy.
Yeah. So you mentioned you could view pornography as a leisure activity. but also coping.
Sure.
Like, what kind of things do you think people may be struggling with at times that actually lead them to viewing sexual images as a coping strategy?
Well, again, the interesting thing, and one of the reasons that we looked at leisure in the mix is because there is a whole literature on leisure functioning as a healthy
Leisure
coping.
as coping, huh?
Yeah,
Oh,
so
wow.
so if I'm a little depressed, mildly depressed, or I'm feeling down or whatever, I might go for a walk in the woods as leisure because it helps me feel better.
Yeah.
Right? So that's a positive coping mechanism. So if somebody is emotionally down or whatever, maybe they'll look at porn and masturbate to help them feel better.
And you do feel better.
And you do feel better.
Yeah.
So is that a problem or is that leisure?
Yeah.
Well, kind of depends on your moral view
Yeah.
in large degree.
Yeah, that's helpful.
But again, I think for a lot of people, sex and pornography viewing can be healthy coping that way.
Yeah. And I think that's helpful to think about it, because I try to view pornography objective as it's a tool. Some tools are really helpful, like a shovel is really helpful for digging holes, but maybe not building a house. So
Sure.
So if you think about it as like, what's the function? Is it helping me? Continue doing it. If it's not
Absolutely.
helping me, let's find a different strategy, a different tool.
Absolutely. And again, it's not an all or nothing thing. You maybe can do the same behavior, but modify it in some ways so that you're more okay with it.
Yeah.
And it's not problematic.
Yeah.
And everybody's going to be a little bit different that way.
Yeah. Wonderful.
Yeah.
So my other kind of big question for you is, what have you seen as like the role of religion or a faith background in someone struggling with pornography later in their
Sure.
life?
I think a lot of the religious narrative goes from the addiction piece. And again, I think that's because of its prevalence. And it's easy to sort of understand for people. But again, it's the wrong model. It doesn't fit. And when we think about our cultural biases and more kind of sex negativity, where we don't talk about sex, it's a taboo subject, we can't educate people broadly about sexuality, there are long historical roots. And religion is part of that.
Yep.
Science is part of that.
Yep.
Medicine is part of that.
Yep.
So we have all of these major
It's not
institutions.
just the church.
Right.
Major things.
All these major institutions that has kind of fueled these myths. So I think in some ways science is still a bit stuck in that. It's starting to change with new research, but I think religion has been kind of stuck in that too. My hope is that in another few decades that will soften, and religion and our laws and again science and medicine will be a little more flexible and open to kind of a broader discourse around the benefits of sexuality and diverse sexuality.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of those questions are rooted in that historical context.
Yeah. So how do we start to like be aware of that context within ourselves, our family, and start to change that to a healthier approach?
That is a really good question.
That's why you're the expert, DJ.
This is why you're doing this webcam right now, right? This is why we started the Journal of Positive Sexuality. No, I think just an awareness of those cultural biases and that sex negative history is a good start. Again, think about if you were born in a different time and place. What would the norms be? What would be okay and not okay? To kind of get some perspective can help. But I think there's a long way to go in terms of trying to be more open and look at this with more complexity. I'm surprised every time I look at a new study, things that we learn and things that we used to think were right, and now they've kind of changed.
It's changing quickly.
It's changing
rapidly.
quickly.
Yeah.
We had a paper a few years ago that we submitted to a number of different journals. This is probably 10 years ago. Reject. And after thinking about it, I thought, this is really good stuff, but I don't think the world's quite ready for this yet.
Wow.
So we waited a few years, and sure enough, 5 more years, this study's published.
Nailed it. Wow. And the study didn't change.
The study didn't change, but the context changed a little bit. So I think, we kind of have to be patient, do our best, cut ourselves some slack.
Yeah.
Be critical, look at things and our assumptions and other, look at things from different angles and perspectives, and all of that I think is really helpful in this.
I like that. So being curious, open-minded.
Absolutely.
But also, it sounds like educate yourself. Like
Absolutely.
turn to real resources. Actually,
Sure.
read articles from your journal.
Yeah. Journal of Positive Sexuality.
Become informed. It's like
Yeah.
DJ's making this as easy as possible to learn about this.
We're trying. We're trying. And have fun with it. You know, I mean, sex is kind of a tough topic.
Yeah.
But we can laugh and we can kind of add some humor. And again, that stance of curiosity is really important.
Yep, it's huge.
Yeah.
So I think that counsel would go really far with someone who's been struggling with pornography for years and years. And
Absolutely.
my experience working with those individuals is they're very self-critical.
Sure.
And it's like, this has to be gone yesterday. I can never
Yeah.
view again, never make a mistake. I need to control urges.
Yeah.
Nobody can ever know. There's not like any room to learn.
Right.
What would you say to that person?
I would say cut yourself some slack. You know, sexuality is really complicated. The World Health Organization says that there are as many different sexualities as there are people.
Wow.
So think about that.
The WHO said that?
The World Health Organization.
Really?
Yeah, this is 10 years old or so.
Oh, I need to see that.
So we tend to think of people in terms of their sexual orientation as, you know, gay, straight, bisexual.
The only categories.
The only categories, and we're finding that's just not true.
Yeah.
You know, sexuality is shaped by your biology, which is unique, unless you're a genetic twin. Your experiences, your religion, your spirituality, your ethics, your culture, your social groups, your family, all of these different things impact one's sexuality. And so you're unique
Yeah.
in your sexuality. So you can't really judge yourself against, you know, rigid criteria that don't really fit everybody. Because sexuality doesn't fit everybody.
Yeah.
We're all different.
Yeah.
So I would say, you know, acknowledge that. Be proud of that. Whatever it is, whatever your sexuality is. Cut yourself some slack. Do your best. You know, try and navigate the complexity as best you can.
I love that.
Make sure you have good social support. I think that's really
That's a big part of
important
it.
too. Mm-hmm.
So if you think about like how powerful sexual drive is and how
Right.
complex it is,
Right,
and then we assume children are going to figure it out mistake-free without any guidance.
right.
It's unrealistic.
Sure. And we tend to look in our society as certain behaviors are acceptable and others are not.
Yep.
And with our research, we're finding that's just not true. If behavior is consensual, if there's an ethic of care, if people communicate well, and they're aware of the risk, they're cautious. And again, we certainly promote people going with their moral views and
Yeah.
you know what's okay with them. But it's more the ethical piece that's important, not the whether or not this behavior is weird or
Yep.
bizarre or strange or whatever. We're finding that so many different behaviors are pretty normal.
Yeah, there's a huge range.
We just don't talk about them,
Yep.
right?
And if people focus more on the ethics and the consent,
Right.
sexual assaults would go down, the
For sure.
violence goes down.
Absolutely.
Instead, we're so focused on, oh, that's weird.
Right.
That doesn't help.
This behavior
anybody.
leads to assault. That's just not true.
It's just not how it's working. Instead
Doesn't.
of focusing on consent, responsibility,
Right.
ethical behavior.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that would make me happier. Like,
Sure.
sexual assault and trauma is some of the worst things I work with.
Right.
And yet, we don't want to talk about that, give that a lot of attention. And yet, there's multiple states, maybe a dozen now, passing legislation that there's an epidemic
Right.
about pornography. And it's like,
Right.
man, there's been an epidemic for childhood sexual abuse
Right.
for a long time.
Right.
Where's the focus and awareness on that?
And again, looking at the research about pornography, we just don't see it as harmful across the board. You know, again, it may be morally inconsistent with a lot of people, but that's important.
It
to
is.
note.
It's meaningful for that individual.
Right, and so people for whom that works need, you know, we want to help them change their behavior so they're happier and
Yep.
more in line with their morals. But
Yep.
we don't see that porn causes aggression and that porn causes sex offending and that porn causes anti-feminist attitudes and
Yep.
all these kinds of things. I would argue that misinformation and uneducation
Does.
is a big part of what's behind those problems.
Yep. And I see that, like I work with folks that there's a fear of I'm going to assault people, or I remember some, they're like, I'm afraid to get married and have kids because what if I
Yeah.
touch my children? And
Right.
it's like, are you attracted to children? It's like,
Mhm.
no. Do you
Yeah.
want to be violent towards somebody? No, but I am afraid that I might. And that fear seems to perpetuate
Sure.
the coping strategy of viewing porn.
Right. Yeah. We see that a lot,
Yep, over and over.
unfortunately.
So what do you say or think about when people talk about porn as being an epidemic, and people or legislators are talking about this. What's your reaction to that?
My reaction is it's kind of like the research on sex offending more broadly. The science is going one way, and legislation and policy is going
the other.
180 degrees the other way.
Wow.
So again, the assumption behind such legislation is that porn causes all of these problems, right? That's the assumption.
Yep.
And so then if we have a lot of people viewing porn, then we're going to have a lot of these problems. We just don't see that in the science.
Yeah.
A lot of people look at porn, but they don't have all these other problems. So that's really the breakdown in logic right there.
That's it. How do we get that message out? Because it's like, we have the data, we've done the research.
Right. Well, that's, again, scientists tend to speak to themselves.
Yeah.
Right? So we need that science and scholarship to go out to policymakers and to the general public and to educators, which is, again, why we think the Journal of Positive Sexuality is so important.
Love the mission.
And we designed it specifically for that.
Yeah.
So
along with that, you published, I think in 2017, that position statement on
Sure.
pornography, sex addiction.
Yeah.
Tell us about that, kind of the origin of that and your desire, impact for that.
So at the time, as the director of research for the Center for Positive Sexuality, and we work close with a number of institutions that research sexuality in diverse ways. And so kind of looking at the literature and looking at the state of policy, including public legislation about porn, and looking at some of the harms, actually, of current models of sex and porn addiction.
Yeah.
We have people who want to change their behavior, and they sometimes come out worse.
Yeah.
Which is...
That's heartbreaking when
It's
therapy
heartbreaking.
makes you worse.
So looking at all these different things and the science, I led this project, and I contacted the executive directors of some different institutions, and we talked about maybe crafting a position statement. And a little bit of background with that, as you know, for institutions and organizations to come out with a formal position statement is rare.
Yeah.
You got to be pretty sure.
Yeah. That's a bold move.
It is a bold move. But we had conversations with our leaders. Again, they research pornography, viewing, and sexual behavior and all these different things like we do, in some different ways.
Yeah.
And we decided, we all agreed that yes, this is needed.
This is important enough.
This is important enough. And so we had some meetings. We wanted to publish it in our journal, and we wanted to make it short, again, in keeping with our journal guidelines and getting it out to a broad audience. And each executive board of these institutions had a vote that yes, this was needed. And when we drafted the document, and we had sex scientists from a number of different countries actually review it, we voted on the final product, and it was unanimously agreed upon.
Wow.
So I think the timing was right. I think we all saw it as a need. Apparently, I didn't know this until afterwards, but there had been a couple of sex scientists who had tried to do similar things before, and people weren't quite on the same page. So I think we just kind of got lucky in a way with the timing, but apparently this is seen as a really important need.
Yeah.
So we're really proud of that.
It's
that we're
an
able to work
accomplishment,
together
yeah.
with that.
What were some of the key things you outlined in that statement?
Well, we looked at the literature, and again, we found that from different, coming at the sex and porn addiction model from different approaches, we found that the research just didn't support it at this point, and probably isn't going to support it.
Yeah.
So a number of the studies in favor of sex and porn addiction have serious methodological problems, not controlling for extraneous variables, for other possibilities that could impact findings, whereas studies that are inconsistent with the addiction model tend to be much more methodologically rigorous. There are a number of studies now, which you're aware, that show that people's religious and moral beliefs are really the key piece.
It's a huge variable that I see.
It's a huge variable, and it accounts for people's perception of addiction.
Yep.
if we control for that, then the whole thing falls apart.
Yeah.
So that's a problem. And then, you know, the American Psychiatric Association, the World Health Organization, they don't recognize this either,
Yeah.
which is important. So people talk about addiction, sex and porn addiction, as if it's a real diagnosis.
And it's not.
And it's not.
Yeah.
Right, and that's a problem.
I can't diagnose it because that diagnosis
Right.
doesn't exist in the manual.
And the American Association of Sex Educators, Counselors, and Therapists,
Yep.
which is another big group,
Yep.
also had a much briefer
Yours is very thorough.
position statement.
Yeah.
Right, they didn't cite sources or anything.
Right.
It's like there's a paragraph,
Yeah.
but a number of these groups are not recognizing it. So we thought we would jump in, but kind of have a nice synopsis of the research
Yeah.
to back it up.
It is so rare. You don't see organizations doing that. So when
Right.
ASEC came out with their statement and yours, it's
Right.
like, this is a big deal. We're scholars and
Right.
people are like, we need to talk about this because this
Yeah.
model, even though it's designed to help people change a behavior,
Right.
it actually might cause more problems and
Sure.
it may be helpful in some situations.
Sure. And again, we see that over and over with well-intentioned policies, well-intentioned approaches, but if they're based on myths, then we're going to be ineffective at best
Yeah.
and cause additional harm at worst.
Yep. And we have good research.
Yeah.
Think about the research out of Utah State on acceptance and commitment therapy.
Right.
I mean, in 12 weeks, 90% reduction in porn viewing. That's pretty rapid change. And,
Sure.
And it's using mindfulness. It's using an
Absolutely.
approach that's been around for 20 years, that over 300 randomized clinical trials.
Right.
I mean, this is a well-supported therapy. It makes sense it would be helpful because it's based on good theory.
Absolutely. And I think that's another mismatch. When we look at the complexity of sexuality, and everybody has a unique sexuality, and a person's sexuality is shaped by all of these different dimensions, you have to have a therapy that kind of fits
Flexible,
that, right?
yep.
It can't be
Nope.
rigid.
Yep.
You know.
Here are these steps.
Right.
Yep. It's got to be marked. Here are the principles
Right.
to help you understand yourself better.
Right. But you're a unique person,
Yep.
and this will help account for that.
Yep.
For
Wonderful.
sure.
So if you had the power to create a public service announcement about pornography, what would you want the public to know?
Ooh, that's a good question. Well, part of me wants to be a little bit humorous with
Yeah.
this. I want to say something like, don't get your panties in an uproar, right? I probably wouldn't say that. But, you know, I don't know exactly what I would say, but I would certainly say something about, the science. Let's base our perception on science, and if we're looking at this as a real thing. And the other piece of that would be, accounting for people's preferences and morals. I think those are the two things when we look at pornography viewing that we have to keep in mind. The science says something pretty clear. This is not a problem. It doesn't cause all these different social issues.
Yeah.
But at the same time, people should live according to their morals
Yeah.
and their religious beliefs and their ethical beliefs, and take that into account too. And to kind of bring those two things together to, again, try and navigate this really interesting phenomenon.
Yeah. That's so balanced. So
Yeah,
if you don't want to view porn, don't view it. Let's
Right.
help you do something else.
sure.
If you do, that's okay. It's
Yeah.
leisure.
Right.
You get to make these decisions.
Absolutely.
Let's take the fear out of it, the myths out of it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that is so balanced. That's never going to work, DJ.
Not for a day or two.
But hopefully we'll get to that point where we can
Sure.
just look at it as leisure,
Yeah,
understand the benefits, drawbacks, and empower people to take responsibility for their life and
yeah.
make decisions that are consistent with their morals.
Yeah, it's going to take a while. It takes a long time to steer the direction of the ship.
It is. But do you
And-
feel like it's moving, though?
I think it is a little bit.
Yeah.
I think it is a little bit. And that movement is starting to accelerate from the time that I've been studying this phenomenon. I think we have a long way to go. What surprises me a little bit is how fiercely political this issue is.
Yeah.
So I have colleagues who have gotten death threats for their science on this. I get hate mail from time to time.
You do, too.
From time to time.
In your mailbox.
Yep.
Oh, my gosh.
And again, there's a lot of hatred, might be a strong word, but maybe it's not, of kind of people studying these things and the different divisions. So that's another really unfortunate part of this. We tend to think of science as this nice, neat process
Clean, it's
that
just
everybody
data-driven.
accepts, and it's not.
It's not.
People argue and they get nasty to each other, and you know, there's vulgarity, unfortunately, just over the methods and the science, and I would like to see that cleaned up and just not be there, because that's wrong from my perspective.
That's actually what got me out of the research game. Is I published these findings. I was just trying to get my dissertation done. And I'm like, oh, it's just data. Publish it. And it's like, whoa, people are really upset about this.
Right.
Even though I held similar views as them, I was just curious.
Sure. And
it made me really step back. Like, I don't think I want to do that. I'm just going to keep helping people in my therapy office.
Yeah.
I'm not pro porn or against porn. I just want to help somebody. And then that message wasn't received well, and that was really surprising to me.
And that's part of the issue too, because people think that if I publish a study on something that's not consistent with this addiction model, that I'm somehow pro-porn.
Yeah.
That has nothing to do with any of this. I'm not pro-porn either.
Yeah.
I'm pro-science. I'm pro-research.
Yeah, me too.
Right?
Where does that club exist?
I do the best research I can, and I get whatever I get.
Yeah. Right? Maybe that's why I like you. It's like, I want to do the research and see what it says, and then let's help some people.
Absolutely.
And I think I have an assumption that that's where everyone's coming from. And that's not always the case.
That is not the case.
Which is, it makes it difficult to collaborate and and make a difference and have a cohesive message.
Right. Yeah. And a lot of younger scholars don't want to touch these topics for that same reason, which is unfortunate.
Kind of scared me away, like, oh, I'll let other people do it, and I'll just keep helping people in the therapy room.
You're doing a fantastic job in your current role.
Well, thank you, DJ.
I appreciate you doing this.
Well, thanks for taking the time today to share your wisdom and insight, and DJ's a true scholar and willing to tackle the tough concepts, the tough topics. I don't know if you've come across an idea that you're like, oh, that's too scary, I can't touch that. You're like, no, let's figure out how to do it and do it well.
From my perspective, everything's open to scholarly inquiry.
Yeah.
And I kind of make a living going into these taboo places and tackling things that people are afraid to.
So how do you deal with the hate mail?
It entertains me.
It does?
A little bit.
You can be curious. That's your leisure activity.
I mean, it's, you know, I had a wise colleague when I started, at a couple actually from different institutions, one in Canada and one in the U.S., but they said, you know, there are going to be people who hate you for this.
Wow.
There are going to be people who will try to get you fired and will try to ruin your career.
Wow.
But you're going to make a big difference if you hang with it.
Yeah.
So they're like, this, you know, this is coming. You know, the battle's coming.
Yeah.
But I've had some pretty good support too, you know. The other thing they said is, you know, if you're not pissing somebody off, you're probably not doing it right.
You're not doing it right.
Right?
Well, we're doing a good job.
If you're not tackling the tough subjects, then, you know, you're probably not having as big impact.
Yeah, I like that.
So
that's one of my biggest fears in my own faith. That I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and there's a lot of talk about pornography and not a lot of talk about healthy sexuality. And one of my biggest fears is how my own church community is going to receive my work. And yet when I talk to them on an individual basis, they're hungry for a different message about, thank you for talking about this, and thank you for talking about mindfulness, and maybe removing some of the fear and dispelling some myths. And so I hope that continues, but I have that fear that man, my own faith community is going to reject me.
Sure, that's a real fear. It's an important thing to be aware of. But I also think, like, if you're doing good work and you're making a difference in people's lives, helping change behavior, they should be really happy with that.
I hope so.
And hopefully that will grow.
Yeah.
So, good job.
Well, thanks, DJ. This has been so much fun. Maybe we'll have to invite you over to do it again.
Sounds good.
Okay.
It's always great talking with you.
It's always wonderful.